All right, so so whether in industry, academia, nonprofits, or government organizations all over the world are struggling to keep up with the massive amounts of data being collected from various field instruments, devices, online services, and more. And in particular, we lack effective solutions for helping people interactively explore massive data sets. By interactive exploration, I mean using an intuitive interface to make sense of a data set. For example, to figure out how to clean, model, and ultimately extract insights from that data to make decisions. Now, why are existing systems unable to support scalable interactive exploration? On the one hand, we have visualization systems, which can produce intuitive image representations of data that analysts can interact with, and as a result, can be engaging tools for data exploration. However, these systems are not scalable due to problematic assumptions being made about the data that's visualized. So either that data is small, say small enough to fit in main memory on your laptop, or if it's not small enough, the user has to go process that data somewhere else first. On the other hand, we have database management systems, where they're known for being scalable, efficient systems for data processing. And examples include MongoDB, DuckDB, SciDB, SQL Server, and so on. The problem with database management systems is that they're optimized for executing jobs in data centers, not necessarily in terms of interactivity or responsiveness to user interactions with an interface, nor in the design of the interface itself. And this snapshot from the MongoDB website kind of sums up the experience analysts often have with these kinds of systems, which in case you can't tell, can be kind of painful. So to scale up exploratory visual analysis to support massive data sets, researchers and developers are interested in integrating database management systems with visualization systems. So the database management systems can focus on what they're good at, efficient processing of complex computation, and the visualization systems can focus on what they're good at, enabling analysts to interpret and manipulate the results of that computation in an intuitive way. And I call the combination of these two systems interactive data analysis systems. So in this context, performance now is not defined purely by query speed, throughput, and so on. Instead, performance is defined by how a system's behavior helps or hinders an analyst's ability to extract reliable insights from her data. So user behavior drives system performance, and system behavior drives user performance. To further clarify the challenges in designing interactive analysis systems, I'll talk about one specific example of exploring satellite sensor data from the moderate resolution spectroradiometer, or the NASA MODIS. So with NASA MODIS data, you can support a wide variety of use cases, say measuring vegetation density, tracking hurricanes, tracking phytoplankton populations in the oceans, measuring snowmelt or snow cover over time. That's a particular scenario that I studied in my PhD. But the problem with the data from MODIS is that it's large, complicated, and difficult to manage. So it's multidimensional. So here's a tiny slice of NASA MODIS data that I'm showing you here. It's multidimensional. It has, say, latitude, longitude, and temporal information. MODIS also records many, many different wavelengths of light, each referred to as a MODIS band. For example, shortwave infrared light, or band B6, or visible green light, like band B4. And on top of this, 2 weeks of NASA MODIS data, uncompressed, takes up about 10 terabytes of space, at least when I was working with it before. So imagine being an Earth scientist wanting to do a time series analysis over a long time scale. That would be quite challenging. So how do we bridge this gap between large, complicated MODIS data and the engaging and intuitive visualizations that I showed you from before? Well, hailing from the database research community, I might argue, okay, a starting point could be to take the data, where here we're focused on snow cover. So to take MODIS data and store it in a database management system. So now we can capture the snow cover computation we're interested in as a SQL query. And here we see a stylized version of a SQL query, calculating a normalized difference snow index, where we're taking 2 MODIS bands, B4 and B6, and calculating the normalized difference between them. So now if we want to visualize our snow cover results, we could take this DBMS and connect it to a visualization system. Where here, we're rendering the results as a geographic heat map, where regions that are more likely to contain snow are colored with a darker shade of blue. So the problem with this classic setup is that database management systems aren't designed to be interactive. resulting in an impedance mismatch between that system and the visualization system. And this could lead to confusing or even biasing the behavior of analysts as they're exploring their data due to lag or other side effects that they perceive through the interface. But the problem of supporting interactivity at scale can become tractable through two key insights that I study. So the first is not any old SQL query is going to be executed on the database management system. The user interface actually constrains the scope of queries that can be executed. On top of this, as users interact with these interfaces, they often do so in predictable ways. For example, by zooming in multiple times in a row. Using these insights, I develop what I call behavior-driven optimizations, where what I do is I analyze how people explore data using visualization systems. I collect that interaction data and build computational models to represent the patterns of behavior that I observe. And I leverage these models in two ways. So first, I deploy optimizations that can take advantage of these knowledge of these patterns. For example, if I have a sense of where a user will explore in a snow-covered dataset, I can preemptively execute those corresponding queries and fetch the data ahead of time to improve the overall perceived responsiveness of the system. I can also take these models of behavior and generate workloads that I can use to evaluate other analysis systems, basically creating benchmarks. More broadly, the question that drives my research is how can we design adaptive systems to amplify the strengths and mitigate the weaknesses of both system and human analysts? To answer this question, I conduct research along three main axes. So characterizing exploration, or investigating the different ways that analysts explore data through various visualization interfaces. Optimizing exploration, so designing new systems and techniques to better support analysts. And benchmarking exploration, or designing new methods for systematic and repeatable evaluation of interactive analysis systems. For sake of time, I won't go into every single project I've done along these three axes, but what I will focus on in the remainder of this talk is how I study the impact of system latency on user exploration performance, how I developed the forecache system to address the performance challenges that I observed, and how I extended what I learned from forecache and other projects into a performance benchmark that connects insights from the visualization database communities. And I'll finish with some of my ongoing work on optimizing and benchmarking for interactive data exploration. So first, although system latency sounds like it could certainly be an annoying thing, it's not obvious how it actually impacts an analyst's exploration performance. So I conducted a series of Amazon Mechanical Turk experiments to investigate this relationship between latency and user exploration performance. And I'll talk a bit about what my results tell us in terms of designing more effective interactive data analysis systems. Where here the context of exploration is navigating large tiled visualizations. So the system that I developed, forecache, and then similar interfaces like Google Maps, take these large visualizations and break them down into smaller pieces, basically tiles. And what I'm interested in understanding is what users do when there's a delay in when those tiles actually appear on the screen. And I had two particular research questions that I wanted to investigate through this series of experiments. So first is, how do people change their exploration behavior in response to latency? And the second question is, how much latency is too much? For example, is there a magical latency threshold where latency suddenly starts to become a problem in terms of affecting users' exploration behaviors? This would be really helpful for, say, the database community, which is often geared towards optimizing systems to provide a better overall user experience. For sure, definitely in reducing latency. However, knowledge of the user's knowledge of the underlying data set can also influence their exploration patterns. Latency is not the only factor. So I'll talk about how I control for both of these effects in my experiment design. So the first is to control for how much information someone knows about the visualization they're exploring. So to do this, what I did was I abstracted the scenario I showed you before. So instead of looking at specific kinds of tiles, say snow-covered tiles, now participants in the study would look at general image tiles. And they would look for a particular target image, mimicking an analyst's interest in searching for something interesting in the data. So with this setup, now I can simulate variations in user knowledge. And I broke this down into three different levels that participants could fall into, starting with being a data novice or knowing nothing about the target image being searched for, up to being a data expert where participants knew about a couple different paths they could take to explore the visualization to find the target image. So now I'll talk about how I inject latency into this interface to see how user exploration patterns might change as latency increases. And I'll demonstrate with an example. So let's say this large box here represents the current visualization, and the user's current location in the visualization is in the bottom left-hand corner. What I do is I insert two different target images that the user could potentially find, and I call them the low and high latency targets, because let's say the user moves towards the low latency target. So the tiles that this user will see will appear faster or with low latency. But if they move towards the high latency target, then the tiles they see will appear slower or with higher latency. Now I can address this first question of how latency affects exploration patterns. For example, if there's no latency or latency has no effect on user behavior, then we would expect that participants in this study would find these targets with about equal probability. But if we see a consistent preference for, say, the low latency target or the high latency target, that would suggest that latency biases people's behaviors in terms of how they choose to explore the visualization. And I can actually model this as shifts in target preferences as latency increases. So here we have a spectrum depicted along the y-axis representing target preferences. So let's say there's no preference for target regardless of latency. Then we would plot a point at the center of this spectrum. If, say, there's a consistent, strong preference for the low latency target, so finding that target first as you explore, then we would plot a point at the top of the spectrum. Now what we can do is add an x-axis here showing what happens as we increase the latency that people see in the interface. So if there's no effect of latency, then we would assume that there should also be no shift in target preferences. But if there is a magical threshold at which latency starts to become a problem, what we might expect is something like an S-curve, where the inflection point of this S-curve represents the threshold that we're interested in. For example, maybe 1 second or 500 milliseconds as mentioned in the literature. What I actually found when I ran my experiments was something more like this, a more gradual, almost linear shift from having no target preference to having a stronger preference for the low latency target. So suggesting there's this gradual increase in exploration bias as latency increases. And I found that whether participants were categorized as data novices or data experts, there was no significant difference in the outcome. So what does this mean for interactive data analysis systems? Well, unfortunately for the database community, I did not find an obvious single interactivity threshold that we could use for optimization. Instead, I found this consistent relationship between increase in latency and an increase in exploration bias, where the more latency there was, the more people seemed to bias their exploration behaviors to avoid that latency. So whether you're reducing 10 seconds of latency or 1 second of latency, it just seems like it's always a good idea to reduce system latency. So to summarize, I conducted a series of Amazon Mechanical Turk experiments to investigate this relationship between system latency and user exploration performance. I did not find an obvious latency threshold, and instead I found that a reduction in latency in general can help to reduce user exploration bias. So now I'll talk about a specific system that I developed called ForCache to address this problem of system latency. So ForCache is designed to reduce system latency while users explore array data, such as the NASA satellite sensor data. And the key idea behind ForCache is that if we can understand how users tend to explore their data, then we can design systems level optimizations to match these known exploration patterns. And to do this, I translated existing theory and human-computer interaction visualization into code by training machine learning models labeled with labeled user interaction data. And what ForCache does is it uses these trained models to drive tile prefetching optimizations. So now I'll talk about how I compute zoom levels and tiles in ForCache. So everything in ForCache, whether it's a data set or a query, is represented as an array, shown here as a grid. So what I do to compute zoom levels is I aggregate every n cells of these arrays along each dimension, where I use a larger n to calculate a coarser grain zoom level and a smaller n to calculate a finer grain zoom level. And then each zoom level can be partitioned into fixed width blocks or tiles. So ForCache can compute tiles directly and incrementally. It doesn't have to compute a whole zoom level first, but I won't talk about the tile optimizations today. I'm just going to focus on the prefetching optimizations that ForCache has. So now let me talk a little bit about the forecast architecture. So it has three components. The first is a visualization front end, which is responsible for managing the visualizations that people can actually interact with. Then there's a server-side optimization middleware layer, which has two components. The first is a prediction framework, which takes interaction data from the front end and uses that to make predictions about where the user will explore next in the dataset. And then there's a separate tile builder component, which then translates these predictions into queries for tiles that actually get fetched from a backend database management system. And here we use the array-based database management system SIGMOD, given its native support for array-based processing and optimization. So Forecache also does interaction-aware caching along every level of this architecture, but I won't talk about those optimizations today. Again, I'm focusing on the prefetching optimizations. So first, I'm going to talk about how Forecache predicts users' exploration goals, which connects to where they're going to explore in a data set, providing us an intuition for where and how they might end up fetching tiles or requesting tiles. So in particular, the first core contribution of Forecache is the translation of visualization theory into a model executable by software, where I translate this theory into specific goals users have as they're exploring their data. Or I call them analysis phases. So foraging, sense-making, and navigation. And the foraging and sense-making phases are actually derived from the Perle and Card's sense-making model. And the Perle and Card model has two major loops of interest here. So the first is the foraging loop, where what people do is they collect potentially relevant and interesting pieces of information. For example, in Forecache, that might look like identifying regions of interest to investigate further. Then the other main loop in the Perle and Card model that we're interested in is the sense-making loop. So in this case, the user takes the pieces of information that they've collected and investigates them in more detail to ascertain potential relationships between them. So in Forecache, this might look like investigating particular regions of interest in more detail. So the thing about the Perle and Card model is that it's not able to capture interactions for maneuvering between these two loops. For example, zooming in. So I introduce a separate navigation phase to capture this missing process. So now I'll demonstrate how I actually apply these phases of exploration through an example. So let's say we're exploring snow cover again, but regions that are more likely to contain snow go from blue to red. So usually when we're exploring, we start at a coarser grain zoom level so that we can find things that we're interested in. So this represents the foraging phase. And let's say we come across this mountain range here and we want to explore it. So now we switch to the navigation phase so we can see this mountain range in more detail. So once we've reached an appropriate level of detail that we're happy with, then we'll start moving around and investigating this mountain range. And these boxes represent the tiles that get fetched along the way. Now, how do we actually use these analysis phases to predict what tiles to fetch next? Oops, sorry. Before we get there, people very rarely explore just one region of interest, right? So let's say we want to explore more than just this one mountain range. What we're going to do is we're going to zoom out again eventually, and then we're going to return to the foraging phase to find something interesting that is not the mountain range we just saw. So for example, let's say this cluster of red pixels in the bottom right-hand corner. All right, now how do we use this information? So Forecache has multiple prediction levels. Now let's say, considering our previous example, the user just performed a panning interaction. This information plus the user's current location gets passed to this multi-level prediction framework that Forecache has, where the top level is the phase predictor. So we pass this panning information to the phase predictor, and the role of this layer of the framework is to just say what analysis phase is the user currently in. Let's say given all of the information that we have, the user is probably in the sense-making phase. Then this information gets passed to a model manager, which is in charge of running multiple recommendation models. And you can think of a recommendation model as basically a predictor of a specific low-level pattern of interaction, where some patterns might be more prominent than others in certain analysis phases. So let's say in this case, model 2 is better at predicting tiles to prefetch compared to model 1 for the sense-making phase. So then the model manager will use this information to allocate space across these recommendation models to decide which to prefetch next. So then we run the models, we get their predictions, we consolidate them, and then we send them to our tile builder component for retrieval. So now I'll talk about two specific recommendation models I built for Forecache, but I do want to mention you can have however many models you want in this design. It's not limited to 2. All right, so the first model that I built for Forecache is what I call the action-based recommendation model. And the idea is that the user consistently moves in predictable directions, which we can capture with simple Markov models, say Markov chains. So we're going to revisit this snow cover example, but limit the movement to the cardinal directions just for simplicity. So let's say we're exploring snow cover and we're panning right, and then we pan down, and then we pan right, and then we pan down. Intuitively, we see this as exploring diagonally along this coastline to look at this snow cover. So though a Markov chain might not be sophisticated enough to capture all these details, it can capture this diagonal panning pattern and extend it to say predict that these will continue to pan right and down. But you could say, okay, rather than fixating on the specific interactions that are being performed, what if we just look at the tiles that are fetched as a result of these interactions and then assume the user wants to see more of the same thing? Well, that is actually how the signature-based tile recommendation model works. So, and the idea is the user just wants to continue to see more of what they've been looking at in the past. So let's revisit this example. And let's say we're panning down 2 times in a row. If we were thinking of the action-based recommendation model, what it would do is continue to predict that the user will pan down. But this is wrong. So this is not my area of expertise per se, but I'm pretty sure you're not going to find a ton of snow in that part of the Pacific Ocean. So what would the signature-based recommendation model do? Well, these boxes represent the tiles for the user's current location and then neighboring tiles. These tiles look similar to what the user's been exploring in the past. So maybe what this model would do is predict that the user would pan right or maybe up back the way they came. So to calculate this similarity across tiles, I compute signatures, what I call signatures. And they're basically heuristics. So for example, you could calculate a histogram of a particular attribute in each tile to estimate similarity. You could apply computer vision techniques to the tiles to estimate similarity by comparing the features that were extracted. And I'll talk about one particular example that I used. So specifically SIFT, I used the scale invariant feature transform, and I extracted it from each tile that Forecache could fetch. And the idea is that because SIFT is a computer vision technique that helps you identify similar objects across multiple images. So what it does is it extracts key points, and you can think of them as like landmarks or unique markers for identifying the same object across images. The idea behind it is that if I can do that, I can potentially find visual artifacts that appear across multiple zoom levels. So when you're zooming in, you're probably still seeing the same thing. It's just a little bigger, a little smaller. So to compute SIFT, what I did was I extracted key points from each tile. I clustered the key points. Then I went back through the tiles, identifying which cluster, the frequency with which each cluster appeared. So then I end up with these different histograms, and then I could use the histograms to compare similarity between the tiles. All right, so now how do I actually evaluate this framework that I developed for Forecache? Well, what I did was I conducted a user study with 18 earth science researchers recruited from UW and UC Santa Barbara. And the participants explored snow cover visualizations, exactly like the ones you've been seeing throughout this talk. They explored NASA satellite sensor data. So given that latency can bias users' exploration behaviors, I had participants explore an idyllic version of Forecache where everything was pre-computed. And then instead, I ran retrospective performance experiments using the resulting interaction logs. So to run these experiments, what I did was I just replayed the logs from that study. I had an out-of-the-box version of SciDB. I didn't do anything fancy as far as the backend. And I compared with a non-prefetching baseline to make sure that prefetching is just generally a good idea. And then I compared with 2 existing prefetching techniques at the time. So one is momentum, where the idea is whatever the user did last, they'll do it again. So if the user panned down, they would pan down again. The other technique I compared with is hotspot. So if we do have access to users' interaction histories, we could calculate in the data set the most popular regions within that data set, and then assume that if the user is moving towards one, they will continue to move towards one of those popular regions or hotspots. In the absence of information, for example, if the user is not close to any known hotspots, then the hotspot technique defaults to momentum behavior. So my results show that Forecache provides 20% higher accuracy and 88% faster response times compared to existing techniques, where a correct prediction resulted in negligible latency and a misprediction resulted in queries having to be issued to SciDB, causing a significant delay in when the user would actually see the results visualized on the screen. So here we have a line chart where on the x-axis, we have the number of tiles that could be prefetched before each user interaction. And on the y-axis, we have the average response time of the system in milliseconds. And we see that for cache, which is the orange line, is significantly lower than the other two lines. So to summarize, I presented for cache, a system for visually exploring large arrays like NASA satellite sensor data. And the key idea behind for cache is that it leverages both theoretical and computational models of user exploration behavior to direct systems level optimizations in a more intelligent way. So to evaluate for cache, I conducted a study with 18 earth science researchers and find that for cache is 88% faster compared to existing techniques. And as a result, for cache can help to reduce exploration bias as observed through my study of how system latency impacts user exploration performance. So now I'll talk about how for cache sparked my interest in improving the way we evaluate interactive analysis systems as a whole. So if you're exploring NASA satellite sensor data or other large arrays, it's clear that for cache can provide some benefits. But if you're an analyst or another researcher, you're not just interested in, will for cache help me or not? You're interested in this broader question of, well, with the grand landscape of interactive analysis systems out there, which one should I be using for my use case? Or which system should I be keeping my eye on if I want to build a better one? And I realized it's actually not so easy to try to answer this question. So what I tried to do at first is say, okay, well, I have evaluation data. Why don't I just look at the evaluation data reported or shared for all of these other systems and then see what I find? Well, for some systems, say Wisdom, Amends, and so on, they were also evaluated in a similar way to for cache, but they used completely different input data sets. They asked people to explore that data in different ways. So they had separate analysis tasks from what I used for my study. And I just couldn't make a direct comparison between the numbers that they reported and the numbers that I reported. On top of this, there are other systems where they were evaluated in terms of performance, but not through a user study. So then there's even less data that I had available to me to try to make this comparison, even for systems that are arguably more relevant, for example, Kyrix. So in general, with the way we evaluate the systems right now, there's just so much variability that we can't really answer this question. So a common and popular way to reduce variability in the way systems get evaluated is by introducing benchmarks. So I would be lying to you if I tried to say there are no benchmarks in the database and visualization communities, because there absolutely are. But the key question here is, are they applicable for evaluating interactive analysis systems? And I would argue that they are not. And I'll give some examples. So TPCH is a very well-known and popular benchmark in the database community for evaluating database management systems for their analytics support. The thing with TPCH is that it's really good at simulating a data warehouse, but it's not good at simulating the ad hoc interactions of an individual analyst interacting with a visualization interface. On the other hand, we have benchmarks like the Visual Analytics Benchmark Repository in the visualization community, which act as a very useful data archive recording how we've designed different visualization interfaces in the past for different scenarios and different kinds of data sets. But it's not a runnable benchmark like TPCH is. TPCH generates queries that can be executed on database management system. The VABR is literally just an online data archive. So here's my vision for what an ideal benchmark might look like. It has three components, starting with a data set generator. And what's nice about this is that you would be able to generate a data set with certain characteristics you're interested in. For example, certain data set skew or data set size, and you could load that one data set into all the systems that you want to compare. And that gives us a nice starting point for an equal comparison or an equivalent comparison. Then we could have a workload generator, which then would drive consistent inputs across these different systems, leading to queries that we could measure to test their performance. And then finally, we would want a consistent set of evaluation metrics to test those systems. For example, the average response time metric that I use to evaluate for cache. So as a first step towards achieving this vision, I led a large interdisciplinary effort in building the first DBMS performance benchmark to test real-time interactive visual exploration scenarios. And the main contributions of this work were the findings of a user study for collecting relevant interaction data for this use case, translation of that interaction data to a benchmark that could actually be run on database management systems, and then the findings of running that benchmark with 5 existing systems, showing that none of the systems we tested actually provide satisfactory performance for real-time exploration, even for what the database community would consider modest dataset sizes of 1 to 100 million rows. So for a database benchmark to be compelling, especially in this space, we actually need the community to be excited about the use cases behind the benchmark. And I would argue not just for the database community, but the visualization community as well. So I'll discuss a little bit about the scenario we picked to anchor the benchmark. And specifically, we chose cross-filter, real-time filtering of dashboards via brush filters or overlaid sliders. And I'll show an example here. So here we're exploring FAA on-time flight performance data through this dashboard built using the Falcon system from UW. And in this dashboard, we have 6 histograms that a user can interact with, and they're all connected. So if the user, say, manipulates this brush filter here on departure delay in minutes, all of the other histograms update in response to the user's interactions in real time. Similarly, if we create a new brush on top of distance in miles, all of the other histograms also update in response to the user's interactions with near immediate feedback. So because of the real-time nature of cross-filter, it's arguably one of the most demanding scenarios for data exploration. So if database systems can support this, they can support just about anything. But on top of this, because we need results to appear near immediate, we need to have some kind of way of tracking this when we run our benchmark. So what we did was we adopted an order of magnitude threshold of 100 milliseconds from the literature. Now, how do we go from this use case to an actual benchmark? What we did was we conducted a user study to better understand how people actually use these kinds of interfaces. And we had 2 specific questions we wanted to answer. So for the first was, what if any patterns do we see in how users interact with these interfaces? For example, do they actually leverage the real-time nature of them? And then the second was, how might these patterns affect the benchmark? So what kind of workload can we expect, and how does that influence how we would design database management systems in the future? In terms of study design, we had 22 participants explore cross-filter interfaces built using Falcon, and they explored 2 out of 3 data sets, so movies data, flights data, and weather data. And then on top of this, they explored the data and completed various tasks that we gave them. And here's an example of some of those tasks. So now let me just give you a brief overview of the study findings. So one major takeaway from the study was that cross-filter encourages continuous interactions. So here we have a bar chart showing the different kinds of interactions that participants could perform during that study. And we found that dragging of brushes, what I showed you in the video, was actually twice as popular as any of the other interaction types. So given the opportunity, it seems that people will take advantage of these kind of real-time interactions that provide near immediate feedback. Second, we find that cross-filter encourages rapid interactions. So more interactions and less downtime in between interactions. So here we have a box plot, a series of box plots showing the distribution of interactions performed on the x-axis, broken down by the data set that was explored and the complexity of the task on the y-axis. And we see here that more complex tasks tended to lead to more interactions being performed. Finally, we find that cross-filter leads to high query generation rates. So not only is dragging of brush filters the most popular interaction type, we also find that it generates the most queries. On average, 174 queries per second, per visualization. And the kicker here is that there's not just one visualization in a cross-filter interface, right? So with the example I showed you before, for any one histogram that gets manipulated, 5 other ones have to update in response. So we actually have to take that number, 174, and multiply it by 5 to get the true query rate over time, which would push this much closer to 1,000 queries a second, definitely over 900 queries a second. Now, so how do we actually take our user study data and turn it into a benchmark? Well, first, what we did was we took all of the individual log records from our study, and we mapped them to equivalent SQL queries using the IDE bench framework. Then, to see how well database management systems perform for different data set sizes, we created 3 different sizes of data set from our user study data sets, 1 million, 10 million, and 100 million rows. To demonstrate the value of this benchmark that we created, we tested it on 5 different systems, selected for their popularity and or support for analytics. So for sake of time, I'm only going to highlight one result here, which was in terms of response rates. So for a cross-filter interface to be successful, we need the query results. We need the system to be able to respond to user interactions within 100 milliseconds with high rates of success. And this is admittedly a very modest threshold. So what a database management system has to do is return query results within 100 milliseconds or less with high rates of success. And we measured this by calculating response rate. Where response rate is the percentage of queries that were successfully executed within 100 milliseconds. And here we see a grid of bar charts showing the results. So in the 1 million rows case, so the smallest data set case, we see that two systems performed pretty well, MoneyDB and DuckDB, where DuckDB is definitely the best performing system. And this is interesting because DuckDB and MoneyDB are the systems that were most geared towards analytics. However, as we increase the dataset size from 1 million to 100 million rows, we see that DuckDB's near perfect response rate drops dramatically to, at best, a 29% response rate, meaning that 71% of the time, those queries were not executed on time where they were dropped. And in general, we find that the best performing systems were still 2 to 4 times too slow to support real-time querying use cases like cross-filter. So to summarize, I led a large interdisciplinary effort to build the first DBMS performance benchmark to support real-time interactive exploration via cross-filter interfaces. So our study shows that when given the opportunity, people will take advantage of the real-time properties of cross-filter interfaces. But in making a benchmark out of the interaction data, we actually found that existing systems just aren't fast enough to provide satisfactory performance for cross-filter, even for modest data set sizes of 1 to 100 million rows. So now I'll briefly discuss my broader research agenda and highlight some ongoing projects that I'm particularly excited about and share my larger vision for this work going forward. So to reiterate, the question driving my work is how can we design adaptive systems to amplify the strengths and mitigate the weaknesses of system and human analysts? To address this question, I conduct research along these 3 axes, which also guide my research agenda. For example, to further characterize exploration, I plan to formalize how existing performance models relate to each other, from models of human reasoning to models of interface structure to database cost models. To further optimize exploration, I plan to design more intelligent and interoperable systems. And to enable broader benchmarking of exploration systems, I plan to leverage my work in user modeling to dynamically derive benchmarks directly from experiment data. So as part of this research agenda, my students and I are interested in helping people build their own high-performance dashboards, where the first step is to help people build their own visualization interfaces, especially with languages that are powerful and expressive like D3. A drawback, though, is that D3 can be complicated and difficult to learn, as a steep learning curve, if you will. So as an example, here's a bar chart that was discussed on Stack Overflow, where the bar chart itself seems very simple, but the code that the Stack Overflow user had to write to generate said bar chart was actually quite verbose. So what I'm interested in is if we can use automation to make it easier for people to learn complex languages like D3. So to this end, my students and I have built a system called Mirni for automated recommendation and implementation of D3 visualizations. So the way Mirni works is that you can upload whatever data set you want in JSON format, and Mirni will infer the dataset schema and use that to pre-populate some templates for different visualization designs in D3. But the user can actually write whatever they want. They don't have to follow one of those templates. But let's say we'll pick one here, like scatterplot. So the user can make whatever edits they want, say change the color scheme of their scatterplot. Mirni will update and show the results in real time. In parallel, Mirni will also recommend interactions that can be integrated into your code so that instead of producing just a static visualization, you can produce an interactive one. So let's say here, the user looks at the recommendations and decides, okay, I would like to include a brushing interaction into my code. So Mirni will automatically add the brushing interaction once the user clicks on it, automatically add that directly into the code, and then the user can immediately start brushing on their visualization. So to build Mirni, we analyzed tons of examples from blocks.org and Observable, including the code and the output visualizations. We took the patterns that we observed and we built them. We used computational models to learn these patterns. And then we also exploited structural patterns in the code to support our automated code augmentation techniques. So analyze lots of examples, trained models to capture the patterns we observed, including patterns in the code. Oops. Accidentally skipped ahead here. All right. But D3 is just one language, and users aren't going to use just a single language. There's actually a spectrum of languages out there, ranging from simple languages like Plotly, or Seaborn, simpler, not dead simple, but simpler, where you sort of trade simplicity for expressiveness. Easier to use, fewer things you can do with them. And on the other end, you have things like D3, where the sky's the limit, but it's more difficult to learn. And I'm interested in how users navigate along the spectrum and how we can use automation, say in Mirni or even systems like Jupyter Lab, to help users navigate this spectrum smoothly, going from less to more complex languages and vice versa. But helping users build high-performance dashboard is not just about building a visualization interface. It's also about helping people test the interface and make sure that it's fast enough. So one drawback of the benchmark that I showed you is that it's a specific dashboard design, and we derived a static performance test, a static workload to test the performance. But in reality, if we want users to build whatever dashboard they want, this is not good enough. We need to provide users a way of specifying what kind of dashboard they want to test and then generate a workload to support them. So for example, if we could allow users to specify their dashboards with a declarative language, then we could use inputs from that language to create, say, a workload simulator. And then we can use existing models of user interaction behavior and then future models that we would derive to inform how to generate realistic sequences of interactions on that specified dashboard, which we could then translate into queries that get executed on database management systems. On top of this, if we have a large data set that we could use to infer how someone would interact with the dashboard, it might also tell us how people would build dashboards to begin with. So something I'm really excited about that's happened fairly recently is that we're collaborating with Tableau to see if we can analyze Tableau public dashboards at scale so that we can build models to automatically generate specifications of realistic dashboard designs, as well as build models of how users will interact with said dashboards. So zooming out a bit, these ongoing projects hint at a larger vision I have for my work, which is that this idea that people grow and change as they explore and analyze their data, and it would be great for interactive analysis systems to evolve with them. As users interact with systems like Forecast and Mirni, they're taking the insights that they learn from their interactions and then developing their knowledge and their expertise. So then the next time they come to these systems or even other systems, they're making more informed decisions about how and why they're going to perform these interactions. So I'm interested in the long term of answering this question of how can we design interactive analysis systems that evolve with the user over time, for example, throughout the course of one or multiple data science projects. So with Mirni, we have a technical report. It's still basically under preparation, but we do have a technical report available on archive. So if you're interested, you can check that out. Yes, that is my talk, and I would love to take questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Leilani. We have plenty of time for questions. And if they come in over Zoom, Slack will help us with those.
Sounds good.
So.
Can I just ask one out loud?
Sure, raise your hand or ask one, Jacob.
But she can hear me, I guess.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I thought the user modeling was really cool. And I was wondering, like, there's kind of the assumption that, like, changing the user interface won't change the behavior. Like, when you're, like you have, like, the perfect no latency or low latency condition. Have you thought at all about how to model, like, how changing the caching would change the user's behavior and how to evaluate that sort of more complex scenario?
This is a great question. So actually the first project that I showed where I was running the Amazon Mechanical Turk studies, the original idea that we were excited about with that series of experiments was, this is not a happy sunshiny way of asking this question, but could we potentially manipulate users into finding a particular target based on the patterns of latency that they get exposed to? So absolutely, yes. I think the system's behavior will have an effect on how people choose to exploit their data. And I'm really interested in this question too for visualization recommendations, because visualization recommendations, or even recommendations on Amazon, right, as you're buying things, they literally influence what you're going to do. Just seeing them will affect your behavior versus, working with a system with an absence of recommendations. So what I'm interested in is in a similar question too for recommendation-driven systems, which is, can you potentially, lead users down a path where they would draw certain conclusions from the data, maybe even conclusions they shouldn't be drawing, through those recommendations, and not realize how much their exploration patterns are being manipulated? This is, again, looking at it from more of like a security perspective, but I find this very interesting. And this question of bias in general as well, because systems can amplify biases that are there. And I'm definitely interested in seeing how we can quantify that, how we can measure that, and then what that means for the systems that we build in data science.
The Mirny you mentioned, I think it's super interesting. And you talk about like the tool will allow users to generate different graphs, like different kind of models. Like so I guess the templates are like still limited. Like what if the user want to build something that is not supported? Like are there any features that might, for example, draw opinions from the experts or like any human in the loop stuff? Yeah,
so the templates are really just a starting point. There were one component of Mirny. A user could actually write a D3 visualization from scratch, and then Mirny would still try to make recommendations on interactions that you could add. But I agree, the template strategy is limited. The idea behind that is we wanted to pretty much mine templates from a large corpus of D3 code. That's where the templates come from. And then on top of that, we wanted to make basically agile recommendations where you can respond to what the user's doing in the editor live rather than relying solely on the templates. But the idea is that if what the user's doing still looks pretty similar to a template we've seen in the past, we could just try to fill in the gap to make a recommendation that will still work in the code. It's not perfect. It definitely still can run into errors. We don't have a panacea. I'm not pretending like we have one of those, but
okay,
that's the idea.
So I have a question. So I really love this idea of capturing interaction traces and using that to analyze performance of the database and the visualization. At the same time, interaction traces are fairly low level. They're not telling you a whole lot directly about what the user is trying to do. And so I wonder if you've thought at all about, what kind of information you would like to get from the user if you could ideally get it as they're interacting with these visualizations. Could we go beyond the kind of low level, point and click?
Yeah, I love this question. So in my more recent work, I've been thinking about interactions basically as a mode of expression, kind of like how we might use words to express ourselves or use other media to express ourselves. And what we have in our heads is never going to be represented perfectly, or at least not right now, going to be represented perfectly with that particular mode of expression, right? There's always going to be something that gets translated. And interaction logs are basically a translation or reverse engineering process. So I don't necessarily have solutions yet, but so a recent work that we had hopefully will most likely be at CHI 2022 is we did a Wizard of Oz style user study where we basically pretended to be a visualization design system, and we worked with experts in public health to understand, okay, if you as an expert, had you recommend yourself visualizations for some other colleague to look at to get started on a new project, say analyzing some national health survey data, what visualizations would you as the human recommend to this other human? And our interest was, in understanding what do people value when they're creating recommendations themselves? Like, what do they value in recommendations in general? And how does that align with, or how does that not align with the way we make prioritizations in how we design visualization recommendation systems? So this is our way of trying to get at, what do people value? What do people care about? And are we aligned with them? So trying to get out of the kind of log data format and think more about, trying to find what people are thinking.
Right.
And then another thing that I'm working on right now that my students and I are working on is in building a new performance benchmark that, rather than just taking the interactions that other people performed and saying, here's the best way to benchmark, just how well would you support this thing these people did rather than the thing these people were trying to do. We want to simulate interaction behavior. And the idea is that if we can think of specific kinds of goals, like classes of goals that people might want to perform, and then we can create an approximation of those goals for a new data set or a new dashboard, then we could try to simulate someone trying to achieve that goal using that interface. Basically, that workload simulator work I mentioned towards the end of my talk, we are making first steps towards that. And what I like about that is it's not just about, oh yeah, this human in the past at some point did this sequence of interactions. If your new system can do that sequence of interactions, then you're good. The idea is trying to get away from that and saying more, here's a set of goals we think users often have. Here's how this goal might manifest with your dashboard. And now we can test whether or not your dashboard will allow people to pursue that goal. And if so, what interactions make the most sense in trying to pursue that goal? So now it's at a higher level. So we still need interactions because they're a mode of, translation. But now we're translating from goals rather than just using the interactions and not thinking about, what they're connected to in terms of what the user's trying to do.
Right. And just to follow up on that, how much do you think those goals and the interactions that result, there are two different levels, obviously, but how much do you think the goals differ depending on the data? Right, and the task. So the tasks will differ depending on the data, but how much difference will there be?
I think there can be pretty significant differences depending. So let's say one data set has temporal data associated with it and another data set does not. That could completely change the kinds of analyses that you have available to you, right. And then therefore your goals.
Yeah.
I think it can have a huge difference. So we're starting small.
Yep.
We're kind of picking a core set of goals that commonly appear, and we're relying on the literature to help guide us there. And then the hope is that if we can build, a framework that people can extend, then as more goals come in, they can just add them to that framework to kind of capture more of the space.
Yeah.
But it's a huge space.
Yeah.
There are a lot of goals someone could have.
All right. Well, we're getting close to the end here. Any last questions? Okay. Great. Well, thank you again, Leilani. That was a great talk, and really glad that you could come down for this.
Thank you so much. This has been a ton of fun. I hope everyone has a great term.
Thank you. We'll see you next time.
Bye.